My newest subscriber asked a question on my channel's page. The question is something like this. What's my take on Keynesian economics? The basics, the pros, the cons. So let's tackle it. Naturally, this is a big question, so I don't think I can answer it entirely in a 10-minute video, but we can at least make some headway. First, the basics. We have to remember why Keynes was doing what he was doing. He was writing in the early and mid-1930s and was observing the fact that we had a long depression with very high unemployment. In the standard classical theory, this just doesn't happen. When investment starts to collapse, interest rates will fall, and that encourages consumption. So the contraction should only last as long as it takes interest rates to fall, which isn't long at all. Also, as the demand for labor falls, real wages should fall. This makes working less attractive and hiring more attractive, so some workers decide voluntarily just to leave the labor force, and the rest find employment. Any unemployment is actually from people who are, quite literally, just between jobs. Now, in the Great Depression, however, we saw both investment and consumption collapse. Interest rates didn't fall very much. Unemployment rose to 30, or at least 25%, and stayed there for a very long period. Keynes wanted an explanation for this. Now, his theory was simple. The classical story hinges on the ability of interest rates to fall and the ability of real wages to fall. But there are limits on these. First, the speculative demand for money places a bottom on interest rates that we call the liquidity trap. Once interest rates hit that trap, they can't fall anymore, which means that consumption won't replace lost investment. Also, partially because of labor contracts, wages cannot fall, at least not very quickly. So, when demand for labor dries up, wages don't fall, people just get laid off. And since wages are still high, people don't leave the labor force, they just keep looking for work. That is, they're involuntarily unemployed. So, how do we get out of a recession or depression? Well, step one is that the central bank should print lots of money. If we're not at the liquidity trap yet, printing money will push down interest rates and re-stimulate investment and consumption. Step two is have the government spend a lot of money. Once you hit the liquidity trap, printing money won't work anymore. So, the only option left is to have someone else step in and spend money where investors and consumers refuse to. That someone is the government. Now, if we're lucky, step two isn't necessary. When things get really, really bad, it is necessary in Keynes' view. Now, in very brief, that's the heart of the Keynesian theory. Now, what do I think of it? First, I think the theoretical basis is questionable if I want to be charitable. First, the liquidity trap issue is a very complex one, so I won't be able to say much here. I'll just mention one problem I have with it. The logic requires that we accept simultaneous determination. That is, interest rates, incomes, savings, investment, and the demand for money are all determined at the same time in a way so that all are consistent with each other. So when investment drops, this causes an immediate decline in income and therefore savings, so interest rates don't necessarily fall. Whether they do depends on what money demand is doing, as it is falling. But really, all of this is silly. It's not realistic to say that all of these things are determined at exactly the same time. But, since in the model it is all simultaneously determined, cause and effect relationships get totally ignored or lost. Now, I'm not going to go into detail because of lack of time, but suffice it to say, I don't buy the argument, and I think it breaks down once we replace simultaneity with a more reasonable cause and effect based approach. Now, second, I don't think that there's any reason that wage rigidity has to be the case. To demonstrate that, consider a very simple case. A company has to cut 10% of its costs to stay viable. It has two options. Right? It can lay off 10% of the labor force, or it could cut wages across the board by 10%. So let's say it decides it's going to negotiate with each person in the workforce. Simply call them in, you say, hey, we have to cut 10%. Either we're going to cut your job, or you take a 10% pay cut. The company decides it's going to negotiate with each individual worker, starting with the person they'd want to lay off most. I'd be willing to bet that very few people would choose just to lose their jobs rather than take a pay cut. So, if wages are rigid, it's probably not the result of the free choices of individuals. Now, I have some theories about this, but once again, time isn't going to allow for me to share them at the moment. But to wrap that up, I simply don't buy the Keynesian argument for how a depression can last for a long time in a market without intervention. Since I don't buy that argument, I also don't buy his prescription for government intervention to fix things. Now, the worst part of Keynes's theory is short and simple. He has no real capital theory. The treatment of capital is somewhere between artificial and totally non-existent in his mind. This lack is what leads to the biggest problems in his suggestions. Now first, as Austrians note, if the structure of capital, that is, the mix of the types of capital goods we have, is impacted by interest rates, then a central bank playing around with interest rates will create booms and busts. Without capital theory, what the central bank does is pretty simple. When times are bad, they decrease interest rates. This stimulates consumption and investment. When the economy is getting overheated, they increase interest rates. That puts a damper on consumption and investment. So everything should be nice and stable. We're smoothing out all of the rough edges. But that's not what happens at all. When the Fed cuts interest rates, specific industries and the capital related to them boom. When the Fed increases interest rates, specific industries decline. So the impact of monetary policy is not balanced across the entire economy, and this creates problems. After all, the resources that we use in some industries cannot simply be moved into other industries. When General Motors shuts a plant down, and that frees up all of the capital equipment they have there, that doesn't help McDonald's get more deep fryers if they're expanding. We can't just take the capital from one place and move it to another directly, and certainly not quickly. So the adjustment process during the contraction is going to be painful. Resources were actually wasted during the boom, as they were being put into industries where it wasn't going to end up being profitable in the long run. Now that we're in the bust, it's evident that it's not going to be profitable in the long run, and we have a bunch of capital that isn't very useful. Now, if we understand the fact that capital is specific in its use, it becomes obvious why fiscal stimulus through planting trees or building roads is a bad idea. Though it may not result in the same boom-bust sort of cycle that monetary policy does, it still, in all likelihood, is going to take real, scarce resources from a more highly valued specific use to a less valued specific use. All that said, I'm not going to say that Keynesian economics is all bad. There are some insights that I think are actually somewhat useful. For example, the insight that when spending falls, it might be that it's not just prices that take a hit. Quantities do too. At the very least, in the short run. I think Keynes is right about that. I also think Keynes is right that interest rates probably have an impact on the amount of money people want to hold. This is something that I hear Austrians arguing against, I think, a little bit too much. Now the problem is that Keynes's error, getting capital theory very, very wrong, leads him to give advice that isn't just not helpful, it's downright destructive. So to sum up, Keynes's theory was developed to explain the Great Depression and give advice for how to get out of it. His theory had a few good insights, but paired these insights with significant errors and omissions. The errors made Keynes believe that policies were necessary that might not have been. The omissions blinded Keynes to the fact that policies were not only unnecessary, but were actually destructive. To draw an analogy, Keynes's theory is kind of like brownies, where the brownie mix was mixed with rat poison. There may be good stuff in there, but you're still better off not taking a bite.